Ancient Rome is often celebrated as the foundation of modern civilization. Its laws, architecture, and governance still influence our world today. But behind marble statues and imperial triumphs lay a darker reality. Rome ruled not only through innovation, but through fear. Punishment was public, painful, and deliberate. Justice was designed to be seen. For Romans, punishment was not merely about crime, it was about control. Executions took place in open arenas, along busy roads, and before cheering crowds. Pain became political, terror became tradition. From slaves to soldiers, no one was beyond Rome's reach. In this documentary, we explored 10 of the most brutal punishments used by the Roman Empire. Each reveals how power was enforced, how society was structured, and how cruelty was normalized. These punishments were not random acts of violence. They were carefully designed systems meant to send a message. Rome is eternal, and resistance is futile. As we journey through these punishments, remember, this is not just history, it is a mirror, one that forces us to question how far civilizations go to preserve order and what is lost when fear becomes law.
Was the most infamous punishment in the Roman Empire, reserved for slaves, rebels, and enemies of the state. It was not designed for mercy or speed, it was engineered for suffering. Victims could take days to die, exposed to the sun, dehydration, and slow suffocation. Rome adopted crucifixion from earlier civilizations, but refined it into a psychological weapon. The condemned were often forced to carry the crossbeam through crowded streets, enduring public humiliation before death. Crosses were erected along highways so travelers would see the consequences of defiance. Crucifixion stripped victims of dignity. Bodies were left unburied, allowing animals to feed on them, an ultimate denial of Roman funeral rites. For a society that valued honor and legacy, this was a fate worse than death. The punishment was especially feared among slaves. After the Spartacus revolt, over 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Appian Way. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would be answered with agony. Crucifixion was not just execution, it was theater. Rome understood that fear, displayed openly, was more powerful than armies alone. Crucifixion was the most feared and infamous punishment in the Roman Empire. It was reserved mainly for slaves, rebels, pirates, and enemies of the state. Roman citizens were usually spared from it because the method was considered excessively shameful and degrading. The true purpose of crucifixion was not simply execution, but prolonged suffering combined with public humiliation. Victims were first scourged, weakening the body before the execution even began. They were then forced to carry the crossbeam through crowded streets, allowing citizens to witness their disgrace. This procession was intentional. Rome wanted fear to spread before the punishment was complete. Once at the execution site, the condemned was fixed to the cross and left exposed to the elements. Death on the cross was slow. It could take hours or even days. Victims suffered from dehydration, exhaustion, and gradual suffocation. Roman guards ensured the process was not rushed. The longer the suffering, the stronger the message to the public. Mercy had no place here. Crucifixions were commonly carried out along major roads or outside city gates. Travelers would see rows of bodies as a reminder of Roman authority. After death, bodies were often left unburied, denying families the right to mourn. In Roman culture, this was a final and severe dishonor. One of the most famous mass crucifixions followed the slave revolt led by Spartacus. Over 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Appian Way. This act was not only punishment, but a warning carved into history. Crucifixion demonstrated how Rome used pain, spectacle, and fear to maintain absolute control. Decimation was one of the most terrifying punishments in Roman military history. It was used when a legion showed cowardice, disobedience, or mutiny. Rather than executing commanders alone, Rome punished entire units. The goal was to restore discipline through fear, making survival itself feel like a punishment. When decimation was ordered, soldiers were divided into groups of 10. Lots were drawn, and one man from each group was selected to die. The condemned soldier was then beaten or executed by his own comrades. This detail mattered deeply because it shattered trust within the ranks and replaced loyalty with terror. Those who survived were not spared suffering. They were forced to live outside the camp, given reduced rations of barley instead of wheat, and exposed to harsh conditions. Shame followed them long after the executions ended. Decimation was rare, but its reputation was powerful. Even the threat of it kept soldiers obedient. Roman generals believed fear was more reliable than inspiration. Courage born from terror was still useful to the empire.
This punishment reveals how Rome viewed its army. Soldiers were tools of expansion, not individuals. Discipline mattered more than morale. Order mattered more than life. By making soldiers responsible for killing their own, Rome ensured absolute control. Decimation turned brother against brother, proving that in the Roman world, loyalty to the state came before loyalty to humanity. It also served as a warning to future generations of soldiers. Stories of decimation spread through camps and across provinces. Fear traveled faster than orders. Long after the blood dried, discipline remained. Rome understood memory itself could be weaponized, and terror carefully preserved obedience long after violence ended. This legacy shaped Roman military culture, ensuring unquestioned authority through dread rather than honor and absolute imperial dominance. Damnatio ad bestias, meaning condemnation to the beasts, was among the most terrifying punishments in ancient Rome. It was used for violent criminals, prisoners of war, and later persecuted religious groups. The sentence was designed not only to kill, but to entertain, educate, and intimidate the public through fear. Executions took place in amphitheaters, especially the Colosseum. Victims were thrown into arenas unarmed, facing lions, bears, leopards, or bulls. Sometimes the animals were starved beforehand to ensure aggression. The crowd watched as death unfolded, cheering or mocking, transforming suffering into spectacle. For Rome, this punishment symbolized total dominance. Humans were reduced below animals, stripped of dignity and identity. The empire demonstrated control over nature itself, showing that Rome decided who deserved to live and who would be erased publicly. Damnatio ad bestias also served propaganda. Executions were often staged during festivals, reinforcing loyalty to the state. Criminals were portrayed as enemies of order, while Rome appeared as protector of civilization. Violence became moral instruction. Early Christians were frequently condemned to this fate. Their deaths were meant to discourage dissent and crush belief. Instead, these spectacles sometimes strengthened resistance, turning victims into symbols of faith and endurance. This punishment reveals Rome's understanding of mass psychology. Fear shared by thousands became collective memory. The arena was not just a place of death, but a classroom of obedience. By turning execution into entertainment, Rome blurred the line between justice and cruelty. Damnatio ad bestias reminds us how easily societies normalize violence when power frames it as necessary. It stands as a warning that when crowds applaud suffering, cruelty gains legitimacy, and power learns that fear, once celebrated, can sustain empires longer than laws, ideals, or compassion ever could.
History remembers these moments not as justice, but as lessons humanity must never repeat again. Burning alive was one of the most horrifying punishments used in the Roman Empire. It was typically reserved for arsonists, traitors, and those accused of crimes seen as threats to public order. Fire, in Roman belief, symbolized purification, but in reality, this punishment represented absolute destruction of body and identity. Executions by burning were often carried out in public spaces. Victims were tied to stakes or confined within wooden structures before flames were set. The purpose was not speed. Fire consumed slowly, inflicting unbearable pain while crowds watched. The screams were part of the lesson Rome intended to teach. This punishment served as a warning against chaos. Arson was especially feared in Rome, where densely packed wooden buildings made fire a deadly danger. Burning the criminal alive was meant to mirror the destruction they caused or were accused of causing. Justice was shaped by symbolism rather than mercy. In some cases, burning was used politically. During periods of unrest, Rome used fire to eliminate dissent and terrify the population into submission. The state showed it could erase enemies completely, leaving no trace behind. Unlike beheading or exile, burning denied the condemned any dignity in death. There was no burial, no memory, no honor. The body was reduced to ash, reinforcing the idea that Rome alone controlled life, death, and remembrance. Burning alive reveals Rome's belief that fear was the strongest foundation of order. By turning punishment into a fiery spectacle, the empire ensured obedience through terror. The image of flames consuming a human life lingered long after the execution ended, embedding fear into the collective consciousness and proving that Rome ruled not only through laws and armies, but through the ruthless manipulation of human fear itself. Beheading was considered one of the most humane execution methods in the Roman Empire, but this mercy was reserved almost exclusively for Roman citizens. Speed was its defining feature. When performed correctly, death came swiftly, limiting physical suffering compared to other punishments used by the state. This distinction revealed Rome's rigid social hierarchy. Slaves, foreigners, and rebels were denied such consideration. Citizenship carried privilege even in death. The method of execution itself became a marker of status, reinforcing inequality at every level of society. Public beheadings were often conducted in forums or execution grounds. Crowds gathered not for entertainment, but for instruction. The message was clear. Rome enforced law decisively, yet honored its own. Order was preserved through controlled violence rather than spectacle alone. Executioners were trained to ensure efficiency. A single strike was expected. Failure brought dishonor to the state. This emphasis on precision reflected Roman values of discipline and authority. Despite its reputation as merciful, beheading was still a tool of fear. The public display of death reinforced obedience and respect for Roman law. Heads were sometimes displayed afterward as warnings, especially in cases of treason. Beheading illustrates Rome's belief in measured cruelty. Violence was acceptable when structured, regulated, and aligned with social class. Justice was not equal, but it was deliberate. This punishment reminds us that Rome's legal system balanced brutality with order. Even mercy was calculated. By offering swift death to citizens, Rome preserved loyalty among its elite while maintaining terror among the lower classes. In this way, beheading served both justice and control, revealing how deeply inequality was woven into the empire's understanding of law, punishment, and power itself. Forced labor in the mines was one of the most brutal and overlooked punishments in the Roman Empire.
Unlike public executions, this sentence offered no spectacle and no mercy. It was a slow, grinding path toward death, hidden from the public eye, but just as cruel. Prisoners were sent to mines extracting gold, silver, sulfur, and other minerals essential to Rome's economy. They worked chained together in dark, airless tunnels. Toxic fumes, collapsing walls, and constant exhaustion defined daily life. Most prisoners did not survive long. Food was minimal, medical care non-existent, and rest almost unheard of. The goal was not rehabilitation. Rome viewed these bodies as expendable resources. As long as labor could be extracted, life was allowed to continue. When strength failed, death followed quickly. Unlike execution, forced labor erased identity slowly. Prisoners were forgotten by society, removed from records, families, and memory. This isolation added psychological torment to physical suffering. The punishment was often given to slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war. It allowed Rome to profit from punishment, turning suffering into economic gain. The empire's wealth was built partly on lives consumed underground. Forced mining labor shows Rome's cold efficiency. Death was not immediate, but inevitable. The silence surrounding these mines made the punishment even darker. There were no witnesses, no crowds, no cheers, only endless labor until collapse. This punishment reveals a system where human value was measured solely by productivity. Rome mastered not only how to kill, but how to extract maximum value from suffering. The mines stand as hidden graves of the empire, reminding us that some of history's worst cruelty occurred far from public view, buried beneath progress, prosperity, and the foundations of imperial power. Poena Cullei, known as the punishment of the sack, was one of the most symbolic and disturbing penalties in Roman law. It was reserved exclusively for parricide, the murder of one's own parent. Romans believed this crime shattered the natural and moral order, demanding a punishment unlike any other. The condemned was first beaten, then sewn alive into a leather sack. Inside the sack were animals, traditionally a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey. Each animal represented disorder, betrayal, or moral corruption. Once sealed, the sack was thrown into a river, where the victim drowned, trapped in darkness and chaos. This punishment was not designed for efficiency, but for meaning. The criminal was denied contact with earth, air, and sky, elements Romans believed were essential to human existence. By drowning inside the sack, the offender was symbolically removed from nature itself. Poena Cullei erased identity completely. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit, no name to remember. The criminal vanished, as if they had never existed. For a culture obsessed with family honor and legacy, this erasure was devastating. The ritual nature of the punishment reinforced Roman values. Family was sacred. Authority began at home. Killing a parent was seen as a crime against society, the gods, and Rome itself. Although rare, Poena Cullei left a deep impression on Roman consciousness. Stories of it spread as warnings, embedding fear into moral education. This punishment reveals how Rome used symbolism to amplify terror. Justice was not only physical pain, but moral theater. By transforming punishment into ritual, Rome taught its citizens that some crimes were so severe that ordinary death was not enough. Order, once broken at its roots, demanded total annihilation of the offender's existence. Whipping and flogging were among the most common punishments in the Roman Empire. Unlike executions, these penalties were part of daily life. Slaves, soldiers, and lower-class citizens were regularly subjected to physical punishment to enforce discipline, obedience, and social order. The instruments varied. Whips, rods, and leather straps embedded with metal or bone were used to tear skin and cause intense pain. There were no strict limits on the number of lashes. The severity depended on the authority giving the order. Pain was not a side effect, it was the purpose. Flogging was often public. Victims were stripped and beaten before crowds, reinforcing humiliation alongside physical suffering. For slaves, resistance meant harsher punishment. Their bodies were legally considered property, and pain was a tool of management. In the military, flogging maintained discipline. Soldiers who disobeyed orders, broke formation, or showed weakness were punished publicly. Fear ensured compliance. Courage was enforced through pain rather than honor. Roman law clearly reflected class divisions. Citizens were protected from extreme flogging, while non-citizens had no such rights. This distinction reinforced social hierarchy with every strike. Whipping did not aim to kill, but it could. Infections, blood loss, and shock were common. Survival often meant permanent scars, physical reminders of Roman authority. This punishment reveals how violence was normalized within Roman society. Pain was routine, expected, and legally justified. Control was maintained not through constant execution, but through regular suffering. By embedding flogging into everyday governance, Rome ensured obedience without constant bloodshed. Fear lived beneath the skin. Whipping and flogging demonstrate that the empire did not rely solely on grand spectacles of death. Instead, it ruled through constant reminders that disobedience would always be met with pain, humiliation, and the undeniable power of the state. Exile was a punishment that destroyed a Roman's life without spilling blood. For many, it was worse than death. Rome was not just a place to live, it was identity, honor, family, and legacy. To be exiled meant to lose it all at once.
Those sentenced to exile were forced to leave Rome and its territories. Property was often confiscated, citizenship revoked, and names erased from public records. The exile became invisible, cut off from society and memory. For a culture obsessed with reputation, this was devastating. Exile was commonly used against political rivals, critics, and disgraced elites. It allowed Rome to remove threats quietly, without public execution. Silence replaced spectacle. The punishment was efficient and clean. Life in exile was harsh. Stripped of protection and status, many struggled to survive in foreign lands. Poverty, isolation, and despair followed. Death often came unnoticed, far from home. Exile punished not only the individual, but their family. Relatives lost honor, connections, and influence. Shame spread beyond the condemned, reinforcing obedience through fear of collective suffering. Unlike execution, exile offered no closure. There was no end, only absence. The exiled person lived on, but without purpose or recognition. This prolonged psychological suffering was intentional. Exile reveals Rome's understanding of power beyond violence. Control did not always require blood. Sometimes removing a person from history was enough. This punishment reminds us that Rome valued reputation as much as life itself. By erasing citizens from public memory, the empire demonstrated its authority over identity and legacy. Exile proved that in Rome, death was not the only way to destroy a person. Forgetting them entirely could be just as cruel and in many cases far more effective in maintaining order and unquestioned loyalty to the state. Public humiliation was often the first stage of punishment in the Roman Empire. Before pain or death, dignity was stripped away. Rome understood that breaking the spirit could be just as powerful as breaking the body. Shame was used as a weapon to enforce obedience and social order. Condemned individuals were paraded through streets in chains, sometimes naked or dressed in degrading clothing. Crowds were encouraged to mock, insult, and spit on them. This public exposure transformed punishment into a communal act, making society itself an extension of state power. Humiliation was applied to criminals, debtors, slaves, and political enemies. Even high-ranking individuals could be disgraced publicly before exile or execution. Status offered no protection once shame was imposed. Honor, carefully built over a lifetime, could be destroyed in a single procession. For Romans, honor was central to identity. To lose face publicly meant social death. Humiliation lingered long after physical punishment ended. Survivors carried the memory forever, marked by disgrace. This method also served as a warning. Spectators were reminded of their place in society. Fear spread without the need for violence. Rome ruled not only through force, but through psychological control. Public humiliation reduced individuals to symbols. The condemned no longer represented themselves, but the consequences of disobedience. The state controlled the narrative, defining who was honorable and who was unworthy. This punishment reveals Rome's deep understanding of human psychology. Pain ends, but shame endures. By attacking dignity, Rome ensured long-term obedience. Public humiliation completed Rome's system of control. Whether followed by death, exile, or survival, the damage was permanent. It reminded every citizen watching that in the Roman Empire, power did not need to kill to dominate. Sometimes destroying dignity in front of the world was the most effective punishment of all. Rome's punishments reveal an empire sustained by fear. While centuries have passed, the questions remain. How far should justice go, and at what cost?